Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. The Naked City, the city of 1,000 stories. Tonight we've told a few. I was treated to perhaps one of the most interesting conversations I've had in the 7 years that I've done this. I would recommend everyone take a trip this immediately, tomorrow if possible, to Spectrum, India, because it's just a fascinating insight into, I think, one of the most eclectic shopping experiences that you'll find in a city, big or small. But it's no surprise that the heart and soul of the coalition, coalitionradio.us, facebook.com/coalitionradio, and of course on the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. But the heart and soul of the coalition is politics. It always has and always will be. We have a special fondness in our heart for independent candidates. Anyone who's ever listened to the show knows that I am the chairman of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party, the ultimate independent party. We barely believe in parties. But I have profound respect for folks who run for elective office. I consider them true patriots. And the reason I say that is because they're willing to project themselves, put themselves out on a limb, whatever cliche you want to come up, sports cliche you want to come up with. But ultimately, these are folks who follow, perhaps unknowingly, our hashtag very closely. And our hashtag is, of course, Take It Personally. These are folks who are willing to take time away from their families, away from their businesses, their careers, and in the true spirit of public service, dedicate themselves to making a better Rhode Island, literally, for everyone. We have a couple of ground rules when it comes to independent candidates. Number one, I'm not interested in polls. I'm not interested in their fundraising. I'll leave other mainstream media sources to obsess, and I use the word obsess intentionally, over navel-gazing into what I believe the minutiae of running a campaign. Quite frankly, and this is no reflection on our current guests or any of the other independent candidates we've had, I don't care if you're going to win. I want to know why you should. There's a complete absence, a stunning absence, a dearth, if you will, of real debate about real issues, minus the hyperbole, minus the Sturm und Drang, minus the drama, minus the moral relativism that seems to be so commonplace. We discuss issues in the light of how someone feels about it, how our candidate or our party feels about it, as opposed to discussing them, advancing them, minus the personality, and actually on their own intellectual merits, which is why we call ourselves Outrage Porn Free, because in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk about issues. Yes, we are Wonk Central. If you're looking for us to discuss our candidates, our visiting candidates' favorite colors, we're not going to talk about that. If you're looking for us to discuss about the latest outrage porn incident, some kid wears a goofy death metal t-shirt in the school, that's not going to happen. There are issues that are in common debate, which we'll actually just try to discuss, not just on a philosophical level, but actually on the merits of the issue themselves. So that's the mantra of the coalition. Joining us now for the first time, he's been here on Go Local Proud before. He had an interview with Kate Nagel, the superstar reporter. All right, is Dr. Luis Daniel Munoz.
Thank you for having me.
And just a quick reflection on the backstory. He is the local boy done good. A graduate of the Central Falls School System, I believe. Attended the University of Connecticut Medical School.
I did.
Doctor, entrepreneur, involved in medical research, involved in medical device design. In my mind, not having met him, not having really talked the issues, because I think we can all agree to disagree on issues, but equally important, given the current state of leadership in the state, is the importance of the character of the individuals and the intellectual strengths of the individuals running for office. So if you look at America and its general design, it was supposed to be a meritocracy. A meritocracy is one where people of scholarly backgrounds, of skills, of life experiences, bring those experiences together and run for higher office to really contribute to the public good. And the reason I asked him on the show is after hearing him on local media a few times, I became convinced that he was someone of that ilk. So welcome to the coalition, and I got to ask.
I appreciate that introduction.
But I got to ask, what would drive you to run this madhouse? Because this place is nuts.
Yeah, well, it's a conclusion that I reached after having all of these experiences. So just to kind of go through my mind, right, the evolution of my decision here. Mm-hmm. Graduating from Central Falls High School, you get to understand disparities on a personal level. Right. And it's not always clear what the solution is or what the path forward is, but ultimately you take the a step, and my step was pursue more education, pursue more understanding. So I majored in philosophy at Rhode Island College, and spent 2 years thinking and understanding how to formulate questions. And I think that's one of the essential skills that students should have at the high school and even middle school level. And in college, after formulating questions, really started to understand that there was an analytical skill that I needed to apply and grow. And so going through that education growth or personal edification, and then getting to graduate school and starting to understand economics, health economics, then business economics, and then taking that understanding in theory and applying it to my experience in industry and confronting regulatory hurdles and bureaucracies. Well, all of those different experiences left me with both an understanding of how to navigate complex systems, how to create solutions as well within those systems, but also gave me the courage to confront those systems. And so after seeing the trajectory of where my company and technology that I had developed was going, realized that there would be a next decision, a next step. And in business, you often plan things out if you're a responsible business owner, so you know where things are going. And so it's been about 1.5 years since I made a decision to challenge the assumptions I made about the current state of Rhode Island and the resources that exist or did not exist. So for the past year, aside from diving deep into policy and budgets and evaluating current leadership and their decision making process, I also started to connect with business owners, community members. And through those connections and so kind of grassroots knowledge as well as book knowledge, came to the conclusion that I could help Rhode Island, that I could help create a better health system. I could address education from a different perspective to ensure that our youth aligned with technologies of the future and that people really had economic opportunity and that you teamed economic opportunity with fiscal responsibility. And so really that conclusion was reached. I moved forward, and of course with my wife's counsel and making sure that this was the decision we were both ready to move forward with, to announced on Martin Luther King Day of this year.
The decision to go independent, I don't want to politically handicap it, but there's a philosophical underpinning there that's part and parcel of your campaign material. So you mentioned, which one of your mantras? Was it people before parties or?
People over party. So I've always been independent. I'm unaffiliated. So that's essentially what I mean. I also evaluate policy and evaluate not candidates based on one position, right? But kind of comprehensively, will they do greater good than harm ultimately? And when deciding to run, it was clear that I would run as an independent and for the people, but it was validated in that I learned how much corruption actually existed in mainstream politics. I mean, I confronted it. I saw it. I experienced it. People that attempt to dissuade you, attempt to, in part, threaten you, kind of gently force you into aligning with their interest. And that often happens when they're concerned about your candidacy, or will be. But when I experienced it, it was validation that the problems in Rhode Island that have festered are not only the result of bad decision making and a lack of technological understanding, but also of this embedded special interest that continues to drive resources away from the people. And that's what I expect to revert, and that's why I'm running as an independent, and that's why I represent, or essentially often use the phrase, people over party.
The most pressing issues in your mind relative to Rhode Island, and I always often call Rhode Island the whack-a-mole state because there seems to be a crisis du jour just about every day. There's some new burgeoning fiasco somewhere on the skyline, just waiting for us to become immersed in it. The late great Vincent A. Buddy Cianci, former longtime mayor of Providence, former radio's talk show host, used to talk about issues as vapor issues, where we would have a crisis, we would discuss it, we probably wouldn't solve it, and then it would simply fade into the distance until the next crisis came up, either revolving around that or, as what I call Rhode Island politics, short attention span theater. What are the pending crises and what are your approaches to it? What you know, you're elected governor. What are you going to dive into first?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just to describe what drives me, I truly believe that a healthy America, healthy capitalistic system empowers its people with good education and the opportunity to live a healthy life. And if the consumers have good education and healthy life, they will be able to confront special interests. They will be able to, in part, as a community, create more economic opportunity and control markets, right? Now, if you don't have that, what happens? You have tyranny of the few. And so when I look at the issues today and what issues may arise tomorrow, I see it through the lens of my 3-month-old daughter. What world in 10, 20 years from now will she live in? What state will she live in? And the vision I have for Rhode Island is one of kind of leading the front on how we educate our youth. Incorporating technology within our school systems like Israel started to do 20 years ago, and bridging our youth as they're learning about technology into our communities to create solutions at that level. And if you do that, then you create an economy. Israel, 20 years after it started making reforms so that students could learn more about technology and connect more with the vocational and technical colleges. 20 years after, it has 2,000 startups, many of them 19, 20-year-olds. It's leading on the cybersecurity front, and every major venture capital extension of Microsoft, Intel, are positioned in Israel. So if we invest in people, and I use this, I use that phrase as well, but this is what I mean. If we invest in our talent, if we empower our youth and our people with skills, then they will attract industries to the state. So that is a pressing issue and one that will certainly take time. Something immediately that I believe we need to do in Rhode Island is we need to stop incentivizing and corporations that have no direct interest in our state or communities with these large tax incentives, and we need to direct, if we're going to provide any incentive, direct it towards our small businesses, right? Because ultimately we have problems in our communities that businesses can help address, through whether it's directly through economic prosperity or also through process innovation within the companies. We have single mothers that often have barriers to employment opportunities and thereby economic opportunity. But what if our businesses were incentivized through certain strategic tax reductions to create infrastructure so that their single mother employees might have internal daycares? Why aren't we thinking innovatively on how we can incentivize companies that help them grow, but also have some social impact component? And again, these are companies that are at a stage where they can either boom or bust, as they say in industry. Right. So redirecting commerce Rhode Island is something that I've released recently in a press release, and that would be my first step. If we're paying people 6-figure jobs or salaries, that is, they should be serving the people. And these are project managers. At least they should function as project managers, meaning that they should be on the ground, they should be coordinating between multiple systems and people. They should be extracting information and data from our communities, from our businesses, translating it over to the governor. Then the governor should be creating a vision and innovative ways into how they can address the problems within a specific municipality. Now, by doing that, by holding those employees in Commerce Rhode Island, and there are other departments as well, accountable for helping the people, creating these bridges to economic prosperity, then we can alleviate, or we can really start to illuminate or shed some light on why we're spending $60 million on consultants. And if you look at our budget expenditures, right, $60 million, what is that being spent on? Why are we spending that much? I believe that we can consolidate government through technology and process innovation, making technology help us do things more effectively and efficiently. I also think that we can reduce spending in areas such as consulting and strategically redirect some of those resources back to the people so that, again, we're fostering more talent and more economic opportunities. So there's all these elements of things that often, if you look at partisanship or the parties, they just go so extreme on either side. Right? On one hand, one party wants to cut every single resource
Until they get elected. That is.
Right, but nevertheless, I mean, the fact is, if you're saying that, then you've already discounted your ability to create a comprehensive solution to the state's problems.
Well, let me jump in for a second. As someone who's a technologist at heart, and that's a compliment. And I'm a libertarian. I look at something like UHIP, and to me, the cloud could clearly have taken care of everything that UHIP promised to be. The state of Rhode Island simply doesn't have the core competency internally to be an engine for vast, unique IT development. You've got companies that operate in the cloud, some through a blockchain approach, others through open systems, or a combination of the two approaches, that could have provided that for a fraction of the cost, and simultaneously then their expertise they could leverage to make profits from other similar applications. Do we belong in things like UHIP, or is a Commerce Corporation belong in being involved at the ground floor level as an investment banking function?
Yeah, well, to address UHIP quickly, I think it was the Economic Development Corp at the time, right? EDC.
Right.
It was named something different. Something was wrong in that contract. The statement of work. When you build technology, you create a comprehensive services or development agreement that has certain testing phases, expectations. At least when I build technology, you don't get paid until the deliverable actually functions. Right. There's all of these standard things that anyone who's actually created technology and been involved in business knows what to do. And somehow that was missing. Because for us to have to pay out all of this money for a product that doesn't work just shows
essentially almost doesn't exist.
Right. So you mentioned blockchain. Here's the challenge, right? I understand blockchain. I've worked with blockchain. Massachusetts Health Information Exchange, a hub for all health information, that is built on blockchain, right? Blockchain isn't only financial, Bitcoin, all that stuff. Actually, I think is going to be so heavily regulated you don't even want to touch it. If you're a state. But for the blockchain that matters, for the technologies that allow us to have a secure and still free-flowing kind of information across different institutions, right? Helping government communicate better with people and with itself. For those systems, it still requires a leader that understands the technology, understands because when you understand technology, it's about the limitations of technology. Right? It's what's the quickest path to failure so that I can avoid that path, right? Unless you're testing, in which case you want to find it as quick as you can. But in either case, the problem in Rhode Island is often that they want to create something custom all the time. We have a health information exchange. We have a hub of health information, but it's custom. At least from what I'm aware of, it doesn't function the same way that Massachusetts Health Information Exchange functions. The technology is different. So when are we going to start realizing, to your point, that there is open source technology, there's technology that's been created, validated, it functions, and they have a process in industry called white labeling. So you acquire the technology, you put your brand on it, it has some basic feature set that's already been tested, and you help people, and you don't overcomplicate it. And if we had done that initially, maybe we would have saved $250 million that we could have then dedicated to our community health centers, which right now have had money taken away from them. So there go our elders and children, or to our school systems, so that ceilings wouldn't have started to fall down. And I'm not talking about the East Greenwich one, though that did happen. But even in Central Falls, the ceiling had fallen down as well before we addressed this issue from a bonds perspective. So Rhode Island needs leaders that understand technology, because ultimately technology is the only way to control cost this day and age.
No, I agree completely. I mean, this has been my complaint. There exist core competencies in the type of blockchain, open source approach where you've got folks who are operating at arm's length from government, who have a high degree of accountability, and who are already creating systems like this that could easily be morphed with a shared underlying foundation, if you will, that whose cost could be extrapolated and leveraged across multiple legal jurisdictions,
Right.
so that we're not invented to make it simple. The notion that as a tiny state like Rhode Island, with fewer than 1 million people at this point, some would argue, would go out and create and build their own fire, build their own wheel, build their, is ludicrous.
Yeah, you from a strategic standpoint, you have to wonder why develop something custom. And I think that blockchain as a whole, if you understand blockchain, represents the decentralization of systems, right, and transparency. So from an information standpoint, you can see what rules are set. It's law in the digital age. You can see whether why has there been inflation of the value of a Bitcoin, right? Or from a healthcare perspective, you can see if health information is moving. You can't see whose health information it is, but that there's communication happening between institutions. And so that provides transparency, right? People can, in the digital age, can see whether what they're paying into, right, as taxpayers, is actually taking place, whether the machine is running, and ultimately whether the rules set in that machine are favoring the people or something else. And so when you have closed off systems, the problem is you have secrecy, you have the opportunity for corruption to fester, you have special interest, you don't know where resources are moving, you don't know where the communications are happening. So I agree, we do need to move in the direction of more transparency, and technology can help with that. But ultimately, Rhode Island needs a leader that understands technology. And again, its limitations more so than its development, but someone who understands both sides.
No, I agree. My frustration as a libertarian is that we, here in this state, we constantly force ourselves as literally the square peg into the round hole, into business relationships, environments, structures that we have no place for. I would ask you this: should there be an acid test every time government wants to do something as to whether or not government, on a simple philosophical level, even belongs there?
Yeah. So this is to your last question as well. So whether Commerce Rhode Island should function as an investment arm of the government. I think that if Commerce Rhode Island is directed towards the people and the businesses of Rhode Island, in that case, then the answer would be somewhere in the middle of yes and no. Because ultimately, our state government should serve the people that are paying into it. That's truly my belief. I also believe that Commerce Rhode Island should have a better grasp on what the cultural changes are, what the disparities are. I mean, any town, municipality, city that is struggling, Commerce Rhode Island should be the first to know, especially from an economic perspective. And with the amount that they're getting paid and with the business experience that many of them bring, if you take the PR aspect out of Commerce Rhode Island, they should be the one, the group, I would say, creating vision or facilitating the creation of vision so that the people can have some validation. Because right now, if you're an entrepreneur in Rhode Island, or frankly a small business in Rhode Island, it's like you're living on an island. not to use the word again, but you're siloed out, right? And expected to somehow overcome the municipal regulations, coding issues, zoning issues, taxation challenges. And who's there to help you? No one. And then a large company comes in, and before you know it, they get all the resources. Infosys fires 10,000 people in India, and then within months claims that they'll hire 10,000 people and change the face of information technology in the United States. And North Carolina, Indiana, and Rhode Island Connecticut, yes, jump in to provide this company with millions of dollars, right? Rhode Island is about 10 to start. Now, what does that tell me? That tells me that, okay, so as a technologist, Infosys, I know, can get lower rate software engineers in India, right? So they implant themselves here, but we're paying them. So what jobs are they going to create? Am I going to bet the future of Rhode Island on a company that just fired 10,000 people to access millions in tax incentives? No, I think they're going to have some footing here. They'll create some business development salespeople, right, to expand in the U.S. And when the money runs out, if Rhode Island isn't giving more, they'll hire labor where it helps their bottom line as a business. So this is where if a person is in Commerce, Rhode Island, this is how they should be thinking. And for some reason to have made a decision that Infosys is the right company, or that GE, when it's selling off pieces of itself, is the right company, well, I think it's a PR stunt. Because again, I'm looking 10, 20 years down the line, and those companies will not elevate Rhode Island. What will elevate Rhode Island is an investment in our youth, and our youth across the state. I mean, we need a force, a cyber force. We need a robotics force. We need our creative minds to contribute to the new types of bridges and materials that are going to make those bridges even stronger than they were before. This is the vision that I bring to Rhode Island, and I'll be presenting this upcoming Wednesday, my education plan, my plan for healthcare, and my plan for opportunity. So I hope that everyone can make it out. It takes place in Greenville Public Library in Greenville, Rhode Island. You can go on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Rhode, RHODE, to Liberty. That's number 2, Liberty. So Road to Liberty, and you'll be able to sign up for that meeting.
And Road to Liberty will also.com will bring you to your
website, and that will direct you to Facebook.
Right. So it's ironic you say, you talk about industry and product development. We have got arguably the finest design school in the planet. One of their dorms is about 200 yards over there. And yet the linkage between the Rhode Island School of Design and Rhode Island as a whole is very, very poor. And that's not because of the lack of the attempts of people in the administration at the Rhode Island School of Design. We have 300 or 400 yards away one of the 2 or 3 finest art libraries on the planet, right here. And perhaps I'm oversimplifying the emphasis because they're one of my favorite targets, but we are essentially giving tax dollars out to aid and abet a company whose primary business goal is to outsource jobs out of the United States. Now, I'm not a nationalist, but there's a fundamental lack of common sense in that.
But again, I think it's easy for others to take that argument and, as you said, kind of push you into a corner with nationalism. But I think we need to kind of bring the argument back to Rhode Island families, right? Rhode Island youth, Rhode Island young professionals. And Commerce Rhode Island is using money that all of us in Rhode Island, create or pull into. And if it's not using it for us, then it's unethical. That's it. I mean, that's it.
I mean, you've got the specter now and the reality of Rhode Island taxpayer dollars being given to companies from outside the state who are acting in direct competition with Rhode Island taxpayers. So you've got the reality of Rhode Island taxpayers essentially funding their own competition.
Right. So you bring up a great point. The governor ran on technology and innovation. My understanding is she had not created technology or really been involved in a technology business. She was on the venture capital side, which, just to educate listeners, very few venture capitalists ever actually get involved in the companies that they invest in from an operations standpoint. And the few that do tend to be on the West Coast in California, many of them because they've been involved in tech. So I say all that to say that while she ran on a technology and innovation platform, and she's created some awareness of that, the terms, right, the phrases, ultimately, I question the whether she's actually going to foster, this administration, whether it's going to foster an innovation culture. I don't believe that the direction that the administration has moved will do that. And why? Well, if you haven't created a software engineering talent pool yet, right? If you have not yet created retraining programs through Real Jobs Rhode Island that actually create software engineers, that actually create roboticists, right? If you haven't done these things and you immediately jump to taxing software services through the expansion of the sales tax now, which the administration calls modernization of the sales tax. California doesn't have that. Anyone that's involved in information technology has avoided that. and yet we're doing it. So before we've even fostered a culture of innovation, before we've elevated our talent pool to attract industries, we've already told industries, right, that Rhode Island is not necessarily the place where you want to really bring your services, or maybe even your corporate headquarters, right? Independent of whether we have talent or not, it's already a deterrent.
Well, the pathology here in Rhode Island is, let's look across industries. We are finding new ways to tax technology while at the same time purporting to try to attract technology. We are finding new ways to tax tourism, despite the fact that tourism remains one of the few economic gems in this state. We continue as a nation and as a state to make it more challenging for world-class universities to exist here, and yet at the same time it can be argued that in Rhode Island, that if it weren't for a handful of top tier, in the case of two of them, internationally placed colleges and universities, that we would be in horrendous shape. I mean, as I'll point out, take Brown and RISD out of this picture economically here, and this state would be in shambles. And that's not to diminish the other fine universities in the state. My concern is this, and by the way, it's interesting because the people that we've had on the show are all addressing this issue, to all of your credit, and to your credit in particular. The notion that this governor seems to think that you can create industry in a state through government intervention, and it's been my experience in the 40 plus years that I've been involved in some level or another in business, is that very often industries occur organically because of the presence of a variety of factors. Universities that happen to specialize in that area and spin off graduates, the cost of doing business in that respective area. There are a lot of us at this point who would like to see, let's get away from the incentives and make, the advantage that Rhode Island has is that in certain respects it's very affordable to do business here relative, and when you talk about things like office space, in certain portions of the cost of living, it should be attractive for people, startups to come here. And you've got a natural constituency in the form of JWU, RISD, Brown, Providence College, Bryant. You've got all these different forces here already. Simply eliminate barriers to entry for everyone. Make it an even playing field where no one is being asked to turn the Commerce Corporation into really an informational source. I was involved in a startup in Utah, and the Utah Economic Development Corporation, whatever they called themselves at the time, primarily focused on information. And again, we're getting into the weeds here, but for example, blue sky laws, how do you, the people, you just don't go out and sign people up to give you money to invest. There are laws and protections and disclosures required to that, as you know. They focused on being able to disseminate information so that entrepreneurs who were here for an organic reason could in fact prosper, because government was no longer a barrier to entry, was actually a partner in giving them the information that they needed to succeed.
Well, let me, Commerce Rhode Island already provides, there's information is accessible. It functions in that capacity. It's just, at this point, the incentives are going outward, right? But if you remove the incentives, it has that function, and I would argue it has not been very successful.
Correct.
And there's states like Connecticut that have had similar, like Supply Rhode Island, where they'll connect smaller businesses with larger businesses, and there's a centralized kind of mediator between connecting small businesses with large businesses, and it hasn't been successful. Rhode Island right now is attempting, little by little, to model what Connecticut has already shown fails. That if you create buildings and incubators and large corporate tax incentives and informational hubs for small companies, that somehow you'll create economic prosperity. That model doesn't work. So this is why I believe that we do need some strategic incentives for our specific small companies. And I say strategic only because we both know that if you say small businesses, large businesses will create subsidiaries and pass-through companies and start acting like they're small businesses for the tax incentives. So targeting our small businesses that are clearly small businesses and ensuring that they have some incentive to help them, demonstrate better, more economic prosperity or more revenues, profits. Now, once that happens, I think that you can start, once you start seeing more talent, more venture capital come in, our small businesses scaling upward, I think you can start reducing some of those incentives and allow things to stabilize. I think at some point you'll have an effect where more businesses, more entrepreneurs, create more cafes, more jazz clubs, and then there you go, right?
That's the organic process I'm talking about.
Exactly, but I do think that sometimes it needs a starter, but my starter is the people and the small businesses, not large corporations.
Right. Now, I mean, okay, you talk about West Coast angel or VC types. Talk about someone like Mark Andreessen, who was, really, at this point, it's funny because he started out as a very young man, all right, and made his bones quickly and ended up, at the time, people kind of look at him, this is interesting, started a VC fund, and has become, his firm has become a huge force.
Yeah, New York City right now.
Right, what do you do then to get that money up here and connect it with the talent that exists? And I've got to believe a large part of that really comes down to tax treatment. I'm not looking to give people money. I'm looking to create an environment where people can make money.
Right, so that's a different type of venture capital, right? You also have corporate venture capital, right? So we talked about Microsoft, Intel, right? Facebook, Google. All these companies now are they want to stay alive. And they're looking for ways to stay alive. That's why we see insurance companies now moving into kind of retail space, right? I mean, everyone's trying to figure out how to redefine themselves. And as they do that, they develop these extensions of themselves, right? Innovation hubs, venture capital arms to absorb new technologies and solutions, services. Exactly, right? Those, I think, are that's the type of venture capital that I'm talking about. Because what it does is it brings those corporations that we don't necessarily want to give large tax incentives to, because how can we even compete with New Jersey and Massachusetts in terms of the scale, right? But instead have the talent that those companies want. So there's a different reason they're coming, but they're coming without the tax incentive, right? So we're making investment to our people, investment that eventually will pay for itself on so many levels in terms of entrepreneurs staying here, quality of life, economic opportunity, more jobs, more businesses. And then we're getting the venture capital, which no one's managed to do, right? And I do want to address one point. Cost of living for a young professional, one that's expected to make eventually even $150,000, but starting at the 60, 65, is, one could say they can live, but it may not necessarily be as affordable as other states, right? So I just want to put that into context that the hurdle, I think, that we have in Rhode Island is for young professionals, for talent, is twofold. One is accessing kind of the pathways that get them to the industry jobs that are high paying, and then two, it is a level of affordability. Like someone that's able, the young professional that has the risk tolerance to start a company, but doesn't have the kind of additional funding or reserve fund to actually make that leap, right? So I think when we talk about cost of living, affordable housing often gets pushed into a direction I think that it shouldn't, right? Which is, everyone thinks, oh, you're just talking about significantly low income families, which I think we still need to think carefully on how we innovate in that area. But it also, it's those individuals that are right there at the point where it's a threshold. And if they had affordable housing and additional money to save, they can invest that in the next company. They can invest that in the,
There's a willingness to jump. What do they call it? Failure to jump. Well, but in here again, get into the pathology of Rhode Island. We, as a state, and particularly in the city that we're sitting in right now, spend an inordinate amount of money providing tax stabilization agreements and specialized financing for expensive housing. And by doing so, perverts the market when the market should really be, the housing stock is here, it just needs investment from private markets, because you're subsidizing high-end development for which there is arguably little or no demand right now. You're doing so at the expense of the market naturally supplying housing where there is demand, and that demand, quite frankly, you talk about young professional housing. I mean, in one sense, we've got incredibly cheap industrial space in this state, where if you're a startup at RISD, and we've had a couple of great ones that have then left once they got to that point.
Yeah, because you go where the venture capital.
Right, well, right. It's so what the missing ingredient seems to be getting those innovators to create that initial innovation here in Rhode Island. They leave to go to Massachusetts,
Right.
which is ironically exponentially more expensive, but that's where the money is. That's where the risk capital is.
So I just want to make it, clear to the listeners and those that are watching the show that I have a plan, an economic plan, an education plan, a healthcare plan, and they're bridges between all these different systems, and it's a comprehensive plan. And my plan, in many ways, takes models that have worked in Israel and in other countries in terms of education, right, for instance, and models that have shown that they increase economic prosperity, increase the amount of jobs, increase venture capital. And we're going to apply it to Rhode Island. And what we'll see with my plan is in the next 4 years, we'll see more youth leaving high school with the skills to access $60,000, $65,000 jobs, right? Not to prohibit them from going to college, but still to provide them with the security, flexibility, and just overall, opportunity to think beyond or outside of the standard box, right? The trajectory doesn't need to always be, you graduate high school and then you automatically have to pursue 4-year college and get into debt before you even figured it out. Now, I want to give students in our state the opportunity to have sufficient skills where they're already applying themselves and able to reflect on whether they're happy doing a certain skill set before they make the determination to go to college. So when they do, it's their drive and their understanding and self-awareness that will take them to the doctorate or take them, further beyond than just, a 6-year period in which they graduate from Rhode Island College, right? Because that's, I think, the average right now, is it? About 6 years. So, it's about 6 years. So, it's about edifying our talent, our youth, fostering that sense of self-awareness, creating an education system that's fostered on earned, right? Earned credits, earned education, sending our youth into the community, helping them build our YMCA's up, helping pushing them to build the blockchain technologies that will connect YMCA's, right? I mean, these are things that we could sit back and have coffee and talk about this all day about what we can do. But the truth is, our youth will do this, but they need a channel. And so what I expect is to channel those resources in. And in terms of healthcare, we need to protect our elders. We need to start rethinking on certain medical applications that help our veterans. We need to create new ways of connecting our resources that we apply to addiction and helping people with addiction, mental health, the suicide crisis, and care coordination. And we need to bring that into a comprehensive community health center. And there are ways of doing that. And I'm the only candidate that really understands the complexity of that system and has an ability of bringing those things together. And I also want to communicate that there is corruption in the state. And there are special interests that have worked against Rhode Islanders. And I will be a governor as an independent that will fight those forces. And fighting may mean, outwardly speaking, about what's going on. It may mean opening up the books and being more transparent, which clearly this administration has not been. But that's what I'll have to do. If that's what I'll have to do, that's what I'll do. I'll fight corruption by any measure, as I help families and help our youth and community, be more empowered.
We've only got a couple minutes left, so let's I call it sort of the lightning round, just a couple word response to probably overly incredibly complex issues.
Yeah,
but
I'll try.
We live in a prohibition society where generation after generation attempts to prohibit functional human behavior. The war on drugs, in your host, what is it, IMHO, has been an abject failure that's done nothing but essentially turn our inner cities into war zones from an overly militarized police department. Should cannabis be legalized?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me share my perspective and do some education. So sorry I couldn't give you a quick answer on that. But I think it should be decriminalized completely. I do think that, so right now we're talking medical cannabis, just to start there. The cannabis or marijuana is scheduled as a Schedule I drug, which in healthcare means that it has less medical benefits than it does risk for abuse. So heroin is in that schedule, right? So the the challenge with marijuana and all the assumptions that are being made in the marketplace, right, if you will, or in the community, is that we haven't been able to study it significantly because they think it's just for abuse. So I truly believe that on the federal level, we should make marijuana a Schedule 2 or 3 drug. As you increase those numbers, or Schedule 2 or 3, what that actually means in healthcare is that there's more medical uses or value, and there's less risk of abuse. So when you kind of make a switch between the notion that there's abuse and that there's medical value, now suddenly the federal government studies it more, or attributes resources. And when you do that, you start to validate, I believe, some of the points that are made. That for people who are suffering from PTSD, right? People who are suffering from pain syndromes, those individuals would benefit from medical marijuana. And there is a large population of veterans that would benefit, right? So while decriminalizing I completely agree with, and I do believe that we should study medical marijuana more, and that should be a higher scheduled drug, which would essentially mean that, let's say, for instance, you go to your doctor every 3 months and they ask you how many beers you have a week, right? They ask everyone that question, whether you drink or not. And it would be the same thing. Every 3 months you go, and a physician essentially says, how are you doing? Are you still functional, by the way? Right? And they do that even for children who suffer from ADHD who have Ritalin. So Ritalin is a Schedule 2 drug, right? So they believe that it's more beneficial than it is abuse. So I think that it's time that we do that. On the legalization side, here's my challenge when people talk about legalization. When I hear someone say that it'll help the economy, that marijuana should be legal because it'll help the economy. My only concern with that argument, as a basic argument, is there are licenses that are going to go behind the selling of marijuana in industry. Now, what do you think is going to happen when a small business or entrepreneur decides to take it upon themselves to sell marijuana? Well, now they're bootleggers, right? And then they go to jail, right? So we need to be very careful in confusing decriminalization with legalization, I think, on that level. Additionally, I think that if it ever does become, so at the moment, my argument is this: decriminalize, and I believe that on the federal level, we should change the schedule of marijuana. That's my current position. In terms of a society that's completely open and free and marijuana is everywhere, again, I do not believe that the people talking about legalization envision that world. It is a highly regulated world that they're talking about, and there will be other reasons why people will be arrested or fined.
Well, I believe in that highly deregulated world.
No, but I mean when they're proposing it in legislation, I don't believe that that's really what they're proposing.
Right. No, I no, your point's well taken. The stadium.
Yeah, so it's complicated, but here's my my take on the stadium. I do believe that even if there's no authority behind voters contributing to the decision, in terms of having a vote, I think it's still important for voters to contribute to that decision. It's a revenue bond and not a moral obligation bond, right? So that's another challenge. I think that the owners should have some kind of risk in the game. Like it shouldn't be based solely on whether they produce revenue that the state gets some money back. There should be some guarantee or something in there that protects taxpayers. Now, if none of that happens, I think I've been the only candidate to say this, then 33% of the food stands and 33% of that parking lot should go to Rhode Island food trucks and Rhode Island vendors. Because I think that's the only way we can ensure that we have an immediate return to our economy. Not that they happen in parallel and all the economic development, no, within the stadium.
Well, let me ask you a fundamental question, though. This is really not just a stadium issue. Why should government at all be involved in subsidizing a private business?
So the question, I'll challenge back, I guess, and say that, if government is intended to serve the people, and if government believes that there is a great public good, right? So we see this on the energy front, for instance, right? If the government sees that there's a greater public good that can happen, is it a moral imperative in part that the leaders find a way to facilitate a process so that that moral good can come into effect, right? It's consequentialism in a way. I think if you're doing this responsibly, it can work. To the stadium, I don't think that theory applies.
Right.
So let me disconnect it from the stadium. So that's not what I'm talking about. On the energy front, I think it is. I think if we are moving more to solar, and we are in part subsidizing, let's say, individual homeowners through some credits so that they can become energy independent,
Right.
I think that's great.
But again, and I've challenged everyone with this, so don't think I'm picking on you. Subsidies and taxes, ultimately, we have a saying in the libertarian world, taxation is theft. We're not trying to, well, some of us are trying to be jerks about it, but what we're trying to say there is that it's a redistribution of income. It's, if you've got these handful of millionaires, and in one case a billionaire, who own an entertainment business. There's an attempt by the owners of the Pawtucket Red Sox Baseball Club to create this halo effect where it's more than just a baseball business. It's almost George Will-like. They're trying to create it like this holy object. Ironically, I'm a baseball fan, a real one, hardcore baseball fan. Right? But if you're taking money in the form of subsidies, and it's a subsidy whether they want to admit it or not, all right, that's money that belongs to somebody else. So if you're subsidizing solar power, you're taking my money and giving it to someone else through coercion. I don't have a choice in whether or not you take my money or not. So our whole point is that, let's go back to the capital markets that we talked about earlier in the show. And this has been great because we're running out of time here, but I don't want to just, after you have a chance this week, I'll give you some time to plug your event again. After you plug your event again, in a couple of weeks, I'd love to have you back on, because this is, to me, is the crux of the whole conversation. You're taking private individuals' money through coercion. I don't get a choice whether I give it or not, when in fact, regardless of the investment, whether it be solar farms, baseball stadiums, human genome development, big pharma, there is literally untold dry tinder, as they say on Wall Street, sitting on the sidelines looking for viable investments. If in fact those investments are viable, there's, we mentioned Andreessen, just one example. There's thousands of venture capital firms and private investors who are looking to find a way to make a buck. I truly believe that capitalism is the mechanism by which the individual can realize their full human potential, in part because of other people's willingness to stake their risk capital, because the return will potentially, after due diligence, be potentially a profit.
Right, but if you believe that and you believe in consumer sovereignty, then you have to interpret that in the context of time, of an era. And in this era, we need actually to help our community recover from years of neglect,
right,
and empower them with education, empower them with health. And frankly, the energy front, I see it from the healthcare perspective. I see the National Grid challenge here in the community of South Providence, right, with liquefied natural gas,
right,
as a health challenge, right? I mean, there's
Absolutely.
Right. So when I look at these things and we define public good, I would agree with you. It can't be public good in my mind. When you invest in one area, should have 12, 20, 100 different points that are positively impacted by the investment you make here.
Right. No, and I'm willing to debate that point. Where I'm trying to convince candidates to draw the line, though, is when that public good is a myth perpetrated by the people. If you're of a certain generation, you're talking about Shelbyville, and you're talking about monorail. If you're of an older generation, you're talking about every boy needs a band. The general consensus being that you've got charlatans, economic charlatans, out there promoting these quote-unquote public goods. We need more luxury housing in Providence. Well, actually, we don't. We need, now, if you're going to talk about power, there's I'll probably disagree, but there's an honest debate to be had.
But like, it almost sounds like a rights libertarian versus consequentialist libertarian, right? Because there is a nice balance between both. I think there should be anyway in society,
But from even a pragmatic level, you're still ultimately taking money away from one person to subsidize. And here, I often talk about the myth, I call it the failed covenant. There exists in this country this notion that there's a covenant between taxpayers and government, that if one contributes in the form of taxation, that government will provide certain services and provide an element of fairness in the marketplace. Government, at this point in time in Rhode Island, and yes, I'm that nattering nabob of negativity, government at this point in Rhode Island is such a complete and utter failure on literally every level. I challenge people all the time to tell me something that the state of Rhode Island does well other than collect taxes. The public, public schools should be the public good, but we contribute, and this goes back to the corruption issue, but the public schools are supposed to be for the public good. The whole notion of public education was founded on the notion that folks from disadvantaged communities, and I don't know your personal background, but clearly Central Falls is a challenged community financially.
I broke through some barriers.
And you are living proof to what hard work and a lot of personal discipline can provide. And I don't doubt that there were areas accorded to you as far as educationally that helped that. But as a broader picture, I believe that covenant is inexorably broken. So when we talk about for the public good, I don't see in this state anything, and there's some very well-intentioned people who work for government, and there's some very hard people who work for government. I'm not here to impugn their, I'll impugn Governor Raimondo's integrity every single day.
But let me just add though, I do believe that there are areas where you can strategically reduce taxes. But so for instance, there's a candidate that had a $1.3 billion tax cut instantaneously. The whole idea that you would even do that, I think, it would challenge my moral foundation in terms of seeing that we've created an environment that, at least in the context of education and community health, is so unstable that to extract all of that, while it may increase economic opportunity, that economic opportunity in that context would likely fall into the hands of the few special interest groups and not the many.
And that speaks to the fundamental corruption of the society itself. So you're right in that respect. I mean, how, the question I always challenge libertarians is, how do we get there, or people who preach small government, is how do we get from here to there? How does that actual transition physically take place? And that's why I like to talk to smart people like you, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's, every sports cliche imaginable comes into play. But how do we, in order to become libertarian capitalist paradise where individuals are treated fairly and not abused, I point out at this moment that the Libertarian Party has something called the non-aggression principle, which a lot of people don't understand. They think we're just cold-hearted, Scrooges, twirling our mustache, ready to starve the poor. But we actually pledge to not engage in practices of coercion or to act in direct. We don't aggress.
Right, and I understand that line, and the people that walk over go into anarchism, but then there's the principle of generosity that I think carries through in a lot of libertarian kind of the platform as a whole. Generosity, that community as a whole will come together and help the needy and ensure that we're contributing in part to education, even if it's through passive diffusion, right? But that theory, if you think of the application of it, it may have been great in 1960. Right. But have you read the book Bowling Alone?
Part of it.
As communities have deteriorated by a measure of disconnectedness between people, lack of attendance in community centers, clubs, and churches, as we've seen this happen over the last 50 years and done nothing to stop it, now we find ourselves in a position where even if ultimately you reflect all these libertarian principles, I do think that there's some adaptation that needs to happen, right?
I on a practical level, I'll cede that ground, but ultimately, I would argue, in direct response to your assertion, which is true, by the way, that a lot of that disenfranchisement, that disconnection that's taken place, has taken place because of the size of government and government's, I believe, cynical intention. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, there is no man behind the curtain per se, but the process of government, by definition, as it becomes more enveloping, actively disassociates people from the community institutions that were so supported for so many years, whether they be, everything from the local Moose Lodge and the local Knights of Columbus to the local parochial or Christian or, quite frankly, any religious school, to any charitable organization. We because of this overwhelm, it's two-pronged.
Well, this is what I'm going to change.
Okay.
Right? I mean, this is what I'm going to change. And the way I think that the medium, that the path to changing is by, again, if you empower what, for the sake of argument, we might define as consumers, if you empower them with education and health, and you gradually improve the use of technology within government to consolidate and to streamline processes, DMV, authentication through fingerprints, I mean basic fundamental things that will allow us to save money, to be more efficient. If you do these things, then I think we'll reach a happy medium. I do think that we'll have less $500 million hiccups.
Right.
I do think that our school systems will be healthier because we'll have outward generosity, sponsorship through the very industries that want talent. But we need to be responsible in how we turn the table.
Right, and again, to your point, the challenge is always be how do we get to this quote unquote paradise where folks, free thinking individuals, can lead lives based on their own individual desires and accomplish great things through the use of whatever talent it is that they enjoy. No, I get it. It's just I'm always going to. It's my belief that government brought us to this point where we are hopelessly dependent on government. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and larger government has take away.
There's always a reset, right? There's always a reset button.
There has to be, because if not, we're screwed.
Now, reset button doesn't mean that 100 years from now we won't end up in the same place, but there's always a reset button, and I believe that we live in a time where there's an opportunity to reset.
And I guess final thought for the night, there's a general distaste by my generation for your generation. The millennials is almost it's not even a word anymore. It's almost a people don't say a millennial. They spit it out at you. Millennial. I find, quite frankly, I have children who are millennials, and I have been blessed to meet a lot of their friends who are talented at a level that exceeds the wildest expectations of my generation. I have found that your generation is, in so many cases, colorblind, ethnicity blind, sexuality blind, religious blind, and is so used to dealing with different cultures in different communities that they've actually started to grow to that point where those no longer matter. They're irrelevant. To the point where, in some cases, I can say I know a lot of kiddos who are surprised when my generation even introduces it as a point of contention. So if there's a generation that's capable of it, it's the leadership in your generation. The challenge is, to a large degree, your generation has got some hyper-talented individuals. But so many of the people in your generation have been left behind. So there's this incredible dichotomy between the uber-talented and folks who've been marginalized, not because of the lack of skills, efforts, because in so many ways the systems that we pay homage to have failed them, largely educational. That's the trend that we're relying on your side of your generation to quickly turn around, because if not, the continual, what's the lack of a better term, we have created educational ghettos in this nation, and they're not based on color or economics, they're based on performance. And there's an entire generation of youth, if you will, that frankly have not been given the skills to succeed.
Well, look, every study, every piece of data that's been communicated over this past since the year has stated, in many respects, that someone like me will not run for governor. I mean, Latino from Central Falls, right? Latino American from Central Falls couldn't do, based on the study as well, poor performance, all this stuff. The truth is that our generation is finally realizing that the hands we've been holding have been holding us down, that the party systems have failed us, that the education systems that have promised to guide us, onto land of prosperity have really, in many respects, deterred us from moving on, whether it's through student debt or through through some random guidance counselor that says that your only path forward is to commute to CCRI right? So these are areas, and I'm pointing at issues here, right? These are all elements, if even you look at Rhode Island Promise, where there is actually a limited opportunity disguised as a broad opportunity. You can be anything you want, but you can only go here. I'm running for governor. That's the experience and perspective I bring, and those ideas or ideologies or limited opportunities disguised as broad opportunities are what I expect to confront. And it's not, being a millennial is interesting. I don't think it necessarily helps the argument, but what I do know is that I don't think any other generation could bring that argument. I don't think any other generation has had the opportunity to see a shift over into a technological age and able to now be very critical of the very archaic systems that we continue to have to educate the youth that's coming up. So we will change a lot. But what I'm doing as a candidate for governor is presenting a vision that bridges generations, right? A vision that is responsible in how we make that shift so that we're not expending so much of our resources in terms of funding on projects that ultimately will not be completed, like you have and several others.
So that morphs and segues perfectly into our closing moments here. I just want to go over again. You've got a major event coming up. It's your policy statement. First of all, I want to give credit to the independent candidates like yourself who are out there openly having. You can agree, you can disagree with these policy statements that are taking place, but ultimately the fact that you're laying down exactly what you believe in the approach you want to take is highly admirable. And the presence of folks like you and Mr. Roselli and Mr. Ferrucci in the campaign, I think, are raising the bar, because the establishment candidates, I'm not going to point out anyone in particular, but one or two in particular, I think Ms. Morgan has done an admirable job of representing where she stands, but the other candidates have essentially tried to hide. And by you coming out with an event like this, you're forcing them out into the open. In a way, I don't know if an independent candidate has done in recent memory. So I give you all the credit in the world, and for taking the high road and willing to run, even at the beginning, an issues-based campaign. So tell folks again where they can find you. You've got this event coming up. Is that event going to be streamed at all, or do you anticipate?
I do expect to stream it as well, but it would be great if I think if you attend in person,
you get the flavor.
Yeah, and I think it's important to look me in the eye and engage me, right? Because through a camera sometimes you can't, you don't have that intuition, right? And I think it's really important for people to understand that there's honesty and sincerity in my vision, my perspective, and my desire to really help Rhode Islanders and be responsible in how I do that. So it's Wednesday, April 18th at 6 o'clock. It starts at Greenville Public Library in Greenville, Rhode Island. Please sign up. There's limited space and seats are filling up. So there's an Eventbrite invitation on our Facebook page. And again, there I will present my economic plan, my education plan, my healthcare plan for Rhode Island. You'll be able to differentiate me very quickly from what the other candidates are saying. And more importantly, you'll have time to ask questions and challenge. So even if you're now supporting another candidate, I'd invite you to come and to give me an opportunity to share how my perspective and vision may differ, and to hopefully empower you with another option.
Excellent. Website again, one more time?
www.Rhode, RHODE 2, Liberty.com, or www.LouisDanielMunoz. If you Google that, you'll find the name, and the website will come up as well.
Excellent. I really appreciate you coming here tonight and spending all this time. The door's open at any time, as I said to only one or two of the other candidates. You don't need an invitation. If something's bothering you, just we're here Friday nights. Come on by. I know there's talk of a candidates forum in its infancy on the Friday before July 4th, when ironically I will be out of town at the Libertarian event. But I hope you'll keep us apprised both through press release and of what's going on in your campaign and where people can see you, because we need to break through the duopoly. We need to make people understand that they can no longer hide behind party labels, that they need to quantify, enumerate, choose the word, but break down specifics. Rhode Island can't go another 2 or 3 years with the kind of madness that's going on right now.
We need change now, and families need opportunity and vision, and that's what I bring.
Excellent. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
All right, folks, you've been listening to yet another extended version of the Coalition. Wonderful evening tonight, a pretty eclectic evening as well, but certainly the last hour and 20 minutes or so have been very, very powerful. This show and all other shows will live in perpetuity on our YouTube channel, which can be clicked and linked to directly from the top of coalitionradio.us. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center at 98 Wasser Street in the heart of the city we love. It's a beautiful night in Providence. Please come downtown. Please support all the independent and local merchants, many of whom I've had on this show in the past few weeks from Thayer Street. Give them a shot. We've got world-class dining, world-class entertainment. It's just, we live in a very special time in a very special place. And it's the type of leadership that's been exhibited tonight and a handful of other evenings lately that I think will help us bring it to the next level. Certainly the conversation in and of itself is special. I can't think of a recent election where we've had more open debate, more open discussion on issues, on facts, on policies, on philosophies than we've had already in a short few weeks in the run-up to the 2018 gubernatorial election. Folks, please stay tuned. Please support our advertisers and sponsors. And as we always like to say at the close of every show, please take it personally. We'll see you next week.